Alright, so we're just going to get after the carb service on this O2 SX Viper. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the top filter element. And there's 4 bolts. There's 2 at the back, just located underneath the foam there. You'll find there's 2 holes, 1 on each side, as well as 2 more in the front. You can see the screwdrivers through that. And that takes these 4 screws out of the bottom of the filter element there. It allows you to lift that off. So, all right, so the next section we're going to remove is this middle piece on the airbox. You're going to remove 7 of these screws around the perimeter of the airbox. And as well, there's a 10mm bolt back here, just in where the control sensors are for your heated bars and everything. So take that out, like such. Set those aside. Move the cables over, and you can take this top section out now, just like that. We'll set that aside. I've already undone all 3 of the flanges. So the boot flanges in the back of the carbs bolt to this airbox. And there's 3 of those rubber boots, and I've already loosened those off. So that's that off of there. And bring these cables out of the way, and that airbox will lift right off there. So you can see there's some dirt and stuff, some oil around all of those flanges and the seals. We'll take a look inside the airbox. We've got a little bit of oil on the bottom of some of those plenums, so we'll clean all that up. This is actually in really good, clean, usable shape. So we're gonna wipe that out. Spray some WD-40 in there and make sure all those air boxes are cleaned up before they go back in. Okay, so with the airbox removed, you're going to take a really good look at everything underneath here. And this is a really important thing to do because I've just found a problem here that I'm going to make you guys aware of. Once the airbox is pulled out, you can go through and do a visual inspection of everything under the airbox. So the bottom, the belly pan or the chassis in here, whatever you want to call it, underneath the jack shaft, you're looking for dirt and debris. You're also looking for fuel. So I'm looking at all the fuel lines right here. And the very first thing I noticed when I started getting in here, you can zoom in here a little bit, you see all these fuel clips on the fuel line? See how that's dancing around? They're all loose. That one's not, that one's not. But these first 2 are completely loose on there. I can move them with my fingers. So then I follow the fuel lines up. They come underneath the jack shaft and they come into the back of the carburetor here. And look at these ones. These are super loose as well. Like they're not holding anything. So what's happened now is those rubber fuel lines have shrunk and dried up, and they're like plastic. They're brittle, I'm sure. So if we're going to pull these off, they might even break. But you should not be seeing hose clamps on the fuel lines all loose like that. So we're going to have to address those fuel lines. But here's the bigger problem. I don't know if I got enough light on the situation, but right here in this fold, this is where the fuel line runs down and comes underneath. And that's kinked. It's all compressed there. So what'll happen now is you go to run this at wide open throttle, you'll be getting fuel in the PTO side, and you get fuel through this line here into the mag side, and that center carburetor, it's going to be starving for fuel. So these 2 will be pulling, and the middle one will be deprived of fuel. It'll have airflow, and that'll create a lean situation and can lead to you melting and burning down that middle cylinder. And that's pretty common in these sleds. So it's important when you service the carbs in here that you check these fuel lines, see that they're not loose connections like this, see that these lines aren't brittle or cracked, and again, loose connections. And check that middle one, because often I've seen before, that gets kinked and that starves, and that'll cause a burn down of that cylinder. So we're gonna pull these carbs out and clean them all up. And before it goes back together, we're gonna be replacing these fuel lines, checking those hose clamps to make sure everything's tight. I've got a 10mm wrench, and we're just gonna undo the 2 cables. There's the choke undone. We'll pull that sleeve up while I thread that out of the block, or out of the rail. Yeah, that's out of there. Okay, and feed that out of there. So pretty straightforward. Same thing with the throttle cable. We're gonna back this one off. And if you take a look over on this side, let's see this cable comes down around that shoe on the throttle assembly. And I'm going to take it up just down at the bottom and lift that cam out of there. And that's it. This one's for the oil pump, comes off the throttle assembly as well. So this you can leave in, you don't need to take that off. On the coolant line on the back side of the carburetor, and I'm just going to pull that hose down off the carburetor. There it is. So you'll see we got some antifreeze running down there. We'll try to clean some of that up after. It shouldn't be too much come out of there, just a little bit. Okay, so much the same on this side. I got the hose clamp, just pinched in a pair of pliers. Pull that down. And I'll give that one a little bit of a twist up at the top. There it goes. And down that goes. All right, so we got all the hose clamps pulled off of the carbs. I've got these pliers up on the fuel lines, and I'm just gonna get a good pinch on the top and give them a little wiggle while we push them down off of the feed lines. Let's that one down. See if we can get this one to go the same way. We're going to replace these after anyway. That one's just about off. And we'll take this one down as well. See that? So those are all starting to shrink and get a little brittle. We're going to change these fuel lines out, but that should allow us now. We've got everything else disconnected. Antifreeze lines are off. Still got a little coolant dripping out there. Got everything unplugged here for the torque sensors. We've got the boots undone in the front, all the choke cables. So now that entire rack will wiggle free from there. And it's out, so let's put that up on the bench now. Shazam! Look at that, it's all cleaned up just like that. I love it when something happens that fast. No, seriously, this is fully serviced now. We've got it sitting up on the same bench, but this is the same way they came out of the sled. So I want to lead you through this step by step and show you kind of what has to happen here before we get into the bowl service and the service of the upper end of the carburetor. So going back a couple weeks ago, I did a service video on an SRX carburetor and took apart 3 carbs out of an SRX, which are very similar to this. But in that particular application, all I did was take apart the lower bowls. I removed the main jet, the pilot jet, the float assemblies, replaced a couple of O-rings, replaced the bowl gasket, and cleaned everything up, sprayed it down, wiped it out, and put it back together, put it into the sled, and man, it worked like a dream. This particular one, I want to take it a step further. So I've cleaned it up, and then what I'm going to do is show you guys some further videos after this that will segment into how we service the bowls, how we take everything apart, how it all works, how the slide mechanism comes out, and then we're going to deal with how to separate the carburetors from the rack. And that's where you're really going to get into the next level. You're going to break this down into individual carbs. We're going to take away everything that unifies this into a controlled rack, and we're going to break it down in a singular form. Once that's done, we'll go through the slide mechanisms. We'll give you a brief understanding of how the pilots and the main bodies work, and all the jetting and all the orifices. And by the time you walk away from this at the end, you should have a really good sound understanding of these 2-stroke carburetors and the slide carburetors, the Mikunis, how they work, how they function, and how to service them. So let's get to the next video. Now the first thing we're going to want to do when we get it up on the bench here is take these coolant lines off. So dealing with the clutch side, we're going to take this long hose off that goes up to the manifold and remove that from this venting right here. And then we're going to come in and remove these 4 hose clamps. So you're going to have to spin those around and manipulate those so you can get at the clamps, close them up, and wiggle them down so that they're in the center of these hoses. The next thing you're going to have to do is take a small screwdriver, and while you're pulling down on this, get a screwdriver wedged in behind the hose up here, and you might have to pry around it to loosen it up and break it free from that brass spigot, because it'll be embedded onto here pretty good. You've had hot temperatures running through there, and it'll almost melts the rubber onto there. So pry those off without tearing them. Get the 2 of them removed. Now you got all your coolant lines off. The next thing you want to do is cut all the straps that are up on the top that hold all this wiring and all these vent lines and everything all together. And all they do is wrap around this bar up here and kind of keep it up out of the way of the functions of the carburetor. So undo all that. Now the vent lines, all these clear lines on here, there's 2 going to each carburetor. We got 2 here, 2 here, and 2 here. And once you pull those off and slide those off, you're going to be left with these little white nylon fittings. This whole little assembly all comes up through these fittings, leads up to this top one right here, and this vents to atmosphere by plugging into the front of that airbox that we removed earlier. So take all that off. It'll all come off as one little assembly. Move it off to the side. Got all your hoses off. You're really kind of starting to get to the point where you're going to take this whole rack apart and individualize the entire build. And that's what we need to do. The first time I looked at this, I went, oh God, I don't know if I can do this. What if I mess this up? Or what if I lose this? Or what if I get this out of order? The first thing I can tell you right now, relax. This thing is a piece of cake and I'm going to step you right through it. So once you got all these hoses out of the way and you're looking at this rack, it's going to look a lot like this side. It's going to be a little cleaner. It's not going to have any hoses and anything dangling out of the way. It's just going to be a clean set of carburetors, right? So we're going to start by taking off these gold zinc plated bars. So this particular rack bar on this side is at the bottom of the carburetor. Take these two screws out, these two screws out, these two screws out. That's going to individualize the bottom of the rack. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the choke assembly, which is this rod that comes through each of the three bodies and terminates into this gold zinc plated bracket over on the far side. You'll notice there's a screw in this bracket. That's the very first thing we're going to take out. So once you take that out, this little assembly is going to pop right off of the carburetor. What it's going to leave is this little plastic shoe right here, this little nylon tip that's on the end of that rod, followed by a spring. So as soon as you pull that bracket off, get ready to capture those two things. Take them off, set them aside, put them up on your clean cloth. And now the only thing that's left are these little cams. And there's one here, and it connects to that choke rod assembly. You'll probably see that little brass nipple in behind it. I'm just going to actuate this so you can see how that functions. So we're going to remove these little brackets, and the way that that's done is we're going to take this set screw out of here. So take that set screw out, come over to the next carburetor, take that set screw out, and come over to the last carburetor and take that set screw out. The next thing you're going to be able to do now is grab this rod and you're going to exit it out of these carburetor brackets. So you'll see this little embossed area. That rod slides right through there. So now we're going to slide this all the way out to the right side. As it comes out to the right, you're going to capture this other spring right here. And that whole rod and all these little brackets and all these little screws, you can just put them neatly in a little pile in the order that you took them out. It's really, really simple to do. And later, I'm going to give you a reassembly video which shows you how it all goes back together. So if you mess it up, don't worry about it. We'll sort it out at the end because it's just going to get easier and easier. So at this point, you have the gold bar off. You have the choke slide assembly off. Okay, so the Torx wires and the little switch that's down here is easily removed. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to tighten this actual adjusting nut on the top. And as that threads down, because it's a reverse pattern, it's going to lower this switch and it's going to pop right out the bottom. So I'm going to show you this little fork on this zinc coated bracket. That's what it sits inside of. And as you loosen this, it threads into this because it's reverse thread, and it's going to pull the switch up. So when you tighten it, it's going to lower it down. But the first thing we need to do is move this cam out of the way. So that's the throttle shoe right there. I've got it in my hand. So as I do that, it's opening up all the throttle gates. So open the gates up wide. Now you can see the switch. So that's the Torx sensor, right? That's got to be depressed on this little stud. When all that's closed, that senses that the Torx position is closed for the wide open throttle sensor. So tighten this nut. This will loosen up and it will pop right out the bottom. It is spring loaded, so it'll just pop right out. Set that aside. Okay, let that go. So now you've got the zinc plated bars removed, the choke slides removed, and now you've got the Torx wire removed. The next thing we want to remove is the throttle position sensor wire. That's the wire that you previously had strapped to the top of the carb bar. Take that, unplug it, and now this should be able to be removed as well. Last thing you're going to do with this is flip it around to the other side. All of this stuff will have been removed, and you'll have two screws left in the gold bar up on top, and that will further separate each of the three carburetors. We'll cut to another video. I will show you how we then open up the tops of each carburetor and how we're going to separate this throttle assembly in the middle, how that all comes apart. It's very, very simple to do, so don't let it intimidate you, because that again, at the end, we're going to show you how to put all this back together again. And what's even better, we're going to show you how to service all the parts in the top of the carburetor, and we're going to take these float bowls apart and show you how to service everything in the bottom of the carburetor. On top of that, we're going to explain how everything functions. So every single part in this carburetor, which are actually very limited, there's not a lot of parts in it. It's going to teach you all about the carburetor, how it functions, how it goes together, and how to clean all the parts and how to put them all back together. And then I'm going to give you a step-by-step until we're all finished and this is all buttoned back up again. So let's cut to the next video. All right, next step. So I've taken the 4 screws from the carb body and separated the gold bars. So there's one at the back and or one at the top on the back side and one at the front on the bottom side. So I've taken all those screws out, and that now has the carb separated from the rails. So the only thing connected now is this black throttle shaft. And that throttle shaft is all controlled off the center mechanism. Hopefully you can see all that in the scene here. So when I turn this, what's happening when you turn the cam on the throttle in the middle, you're pulling on the throttle lever, it's turning this bar, which is connected to these cams. So this particular cam right here, if you're looking at this one, is connected to your slide mechanism. So there's a host of little transfer points on this. And every time you twist that throttle, it's raising that valve open, which in turn exposes and removes the needle from the lower main nozzle, and of course your jet's underneath there, and that's allowing the fuel to come up through there. So we'll get into the bottom here in a minute, but I wanted you to see how this mechanism works, so that when you're twisting that throttle, this is what's happening, is this bar is controlling all of these slides and these gates. So we're going to take this screw out here next, and that's the last thing that's holding this carb body onto this rail. This is threaded right through this black shaft, so when that screw goes in, it goes through the cam into that black rod and locks it in place so that everything is perfectly timed. So let's take that out of there now. All right, so I've removed that screw from the top of that cam. That's the one with the washer there, so I'll lay that down. And that's the last thing that holds us on here. So we'll slide this body off here, and then we'll talk about this throttle position switch a little bit. So you can see that's easily coming off. Now, I've had this off once already. This is just for the sake of showing you guys. So you'll see on the end of this shaft here that it's got a flat spot on it. So that particular part of the shaft is going to go clean through this carb body, through the top, through this slide mechanism or the carrier for it, and in through the other side here, and it's going to end up terminating inside of this switch. So here's an important part. This throttle position switch that's right here, I'm just going to turn this light so you can see that better. This is set up and it's keyed to that shaft. So if you take this apart and you take note of all this, you should be able to theoretically put it back together without any issues. If you don't take note of where this is positioned, you'll see that these are elongated slots on each side of this. So that can be keyed forward or back. This throttle position switch has an ohms and a voltage rating to it. So depending on where it's situated, it's going to read a different ohms reading, whether it's 4 to 6 or whatever the spec calls for. It's in section 7 of the carburetor section. So take a good read of that before you take this apart. All I did is noted exactly where this was. It was pretty much clocked all the way to the left on mine. And I'm putting everything back exactly the same way without any modifications to the settings. So I should have no issues with this working. So I've got this large slot here and a large slot above the screw here, which means that it's keyed to the left. If I have any issues with the TPS sensor, when I plug it all back in and fire all this up after, I can always adapt the battery and put a little kit together to measure this with an ohms meter and make sure I get this clocked and positioned correctly. So just make note of that. You should be able to take this off and put it back on the same way, as long as you're not making any adjustments on the rest of the carrier and the slide mechanisms. So anyway, just a little food for thought. All right, so next up, I'm going to set these other parts aside. That's the lid for the top, the screws and the gasket, and the other screws. Put that onto the rail. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the float bowl off here. And this, I've had this off and cleaned this. I want to do this again just to give you guys a better view of exactly what's involved in servicing the lower bowl section, which is probably 75 or 80% of the carb cleaning process is all in the lower section. So I'm going to take these 4 screws out. I've broken them all free, and we'll spin them out. No power tools are needed for this. Once again, if you're using cordless drills to take these screws off, chances are you're going to strip one or break one, and you're going to end up regretting it. So I'll just take them out with a normal screwdriver. That's all it needs. Take this last screw out. Bowl is off. Capture that last screw. So I've already cleaned all these. I've put brand new gaskets in them, a new O-ring. So there's a few components you're going to want to service in the bottom of the carburetor before we get into the top. So we're going to remove the main jet and this little plastic diffuser here, which is called a washer. And there's a little sleeve around the main nozzle, which is underneath all this. And that's all in this center section. Then we're going to remove the pilot jet right here, which is inside this little tube. I'll try to get closer in there so you can see the head of the jet in there. And the last thing we're going to do, not last thing, but the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the float mechanism, which has got the needle and seat underneath it. I'm going to grab a little screwdriver here. You can see here that on the bottom of this float assembly, there's this little wire right here, that little gate. And that is connected to the needle that goes into the seat and connects to this little tab on your float assembly. So important that you pay attention to that. So let's get into this right now. We'll take this apart, show you what's got to be cleaned. So the first thing we're going to take out is the pilot jet. Use the appropriate size screwdriver for it. Don't try to get it with a little dinky screwdriver that doesn't fit the head of it. And then once you got the tube out, we're going to pull out this jet. And you're going to ensure that the orifice is clean inside of there and that you can see all the way through it. And that all these little orifices here on the side are completely unclogged. So you're probably going to want to immerse this in carb cleaner or an ultrasonic cleaner to clean it all out, and then blow it out and ensure that you can see clear through there and that there's a clear passage through there when you're done. We'll get into the whole bowl cleaning process and everything after. The next thing we're going to take off is going to be the main jet. Use an appropriate screwdriver for it that fits it. Once you take that out, you can take the main jet out. This particular one is a 153.8. It's ideal for elevations between 1,700 and 3,000 feet above sea level, which is where I'm at. And it's ideal for temperatures which are minus 18 or warmer in Celsius. I forget what that is in Fahrenheit. Again, I'm in Canada, so it's how we measure things. So this little washer is attached to this little brass sleeve, and that fits over top of the main nozzle. And the main nozzle is up inside the carb body. And it's going to be difficult to see here, but there's a little pin. You'll see a brass pin in through the aluminum. That comes up into this slot right here, and that's keyed so that this only goes in one way. You can't put it in a different position, so it keeps it where it's supposed to be. And if I look through there, you see when I raise up the gate, you'll see the needle in there. So that's up in the top section, and we'll get to that in a moment. And you can see in the middle of the floor there, you'll see that brass colored main nozzle, and it's just sitting there in the floor. So next up, we're going to take this whole apparatus out of the top. That's the whole slide mechanism and everything in my hand with the needle valve. And there's two small T10 Allen head, they're socket cap screws in there. So there's one in the right corner. If I flip this around, there's one down there in the left corner. You're going to need a T10 with a rounded ball end to get in there to take those out. We'll get that later in the video, but we'll set this whole slide mechanism aside for now. That removes it from here. The next thing we want to do is take out this lower main nozzle, and by pushing that up into there, I can bring it up through the carb body, bring it out of the carburetor. Now, I've already cleaned all this. I've put this through the carb cleaner and everything else, but that's got to be cleaned. Your main jet needs to be cleaned, and your pilot jet needs to be cleaned. So these are the three orifices that are critical to the bottom of the carburetor. Hopefully you can see all those sitting right there. So what else do we have? In the bottom of the carb here, we've also got the float valve assembly to take out. So we're going to start doing that by taking out this pin. And you'll see that it's got like a nail size head on the one side and a little pin that comes up into the other side. You do not want to pry on this. You don't want to try to get in behind that nail and pry on it. If you do, chances are you're going to break this little leg, and that's cast. And once you've broken that, you're basically throwing that carb body away. So what I do is I put my finger underneath there so I can feel the head of the pin. I take this automatic center punch, I put it on the back side of the pin, and I start pushing it out. So there's one, and it moved it about a 1/16 of an inch. That moved it some more. So you can see it's ready to drop out. I've got a little pin follower. I just push that pin through there. That takes the pin out. And now I can lift out, put my finger on the little gate. You can pull this up here so you can see it. Those are the little wire gates for the needle valve in that float assembly. So there's the needle valve there. I've already cleaned all this. I wanted to take this out again just to show you guys how this particular thing comes out. What I like to do is remove that pin, put my finger on that gate so I don't drop anything, and then I carefully, see I've got it realigned there. I lift all this out in one piece, and then I take this, separate it, and set that aside so it doesn't get lost. And the next thing we've got here is the float valve. And to pull that out, there is an O-ring on it that we want to service. There's a little set screw right here, or a captive washer screw with a captive head on it. By taking that out of the body, it doesn't take much, it's just a little machine screw. It's like a 632 or something like that. Take that out, set it aside, and now you've got your float valve. Grab that with a pair of needle nose gently, and you should be able to just wiggle that and pull it out like such. So again, I've already cleaned this and run it through the carb cleaner and the parts cleaner and blown it all out. So I've cleaned the little screen on it, blown through the orifice to make sure it's clear on the other side. So that's all good to go. And I've put a brand new O-ring on this, and I've noted that part in the message header on this YouTube video so that you can order a new one if you need to. And I've cleaned all this carburetor up. So those are the main parts you're going to clean. And again, you've got the pilot valve, the float valve, your float needle, which goes into the float valve, your main jet, and your main nozzle. And those are all your brass pieces. So those all need to be cleaned in carb cleaner and blown out. Once they're all good, you can put all these back in order to put them back in. A couple more things you might want to service while you have the bottom of the carb apart. I highly suggest you remove the mixture screw. Some people call this the pilot needle adjustable. I call it a mixture screw. And I'm going to pull that out, and you'll see when I get it going here. It's just about out of there now. I carefully lift it out, and you can see here it's a needle screw with a very small point to it. There's no contaminants on it. I've already cleaned off the spring and everything else. And right above the spring at this end, there's a little washer. I believe it's brass or a little steel washer, and then there's a little tiny rubber O-ring. If you can get that from your dealer, you're best, if you're taking this out, clean out this orifice. When you clean the body or clean all the orifices out, spray it all out with carb cleaner. When you're finished with all that, blow it all out with compressed air. Make sure all the channels and orifices are all blown out. Make sure you got good eye protection on. And then you can put this back in once you're satisfied that this chamber is cleaned out, which I've already done. So I'm going to go ahead and reinsert that. Because I've already cleaned this carb, I'm just taking this one apart to kind of show you guys, again, as a reference, what it is you're going to be cleaning in the bottom of the carburetor while servicing it, getting it ready for the season. And if I can keep the screwdriver intact where it's supposed to be, I'll be able to get this screwed in. So this goes in all the way on this particular series for a Viper 700. Screw it all the way in, not tight, just until it stops. And then it's back it out 1.78 turns. So there's a half a turn, another half is 1, the other half 1.5, another half is 2, and then I'm going to turn it back in 1/8 of a turn. So we're 1 7/8 out. The only other thing that's in here is an air bleed valve. In this particular one, I've had all these out before and cleaned them. This is a 1.0. They're very small. They're tight. They don't like to be removed and taken in and out a whole bunch of times because they will kind of self-destruct in terms of that screwdriver fitting in there. I don't need to take that out now, so I'm good. Everything else is stripped out of the bottom. I take these out when I immerse the whole body, and that's kind of the next level. You can clean all this up just with carb cleaner and blowing it all out. When you take it to the next level, as I'm doing with this carb, you're going to remove the whole slide mechanism. You're going to take out everything else out of the carburetor. You'll take that adjusting screw out of there for the air-fuel mixture. Everything else in the bottom of the carb has now been stripped. You're going to take this choke plunger out of there. I'll do that next. And then you're going to take this switch off, and again, pay attention to where it's keyed and take pictures of it. So when you put it back in, you can try to be as bang on to 100% on the positioning and the timing of that particular switch. So I'm going to take that out now just so you can see the rest of the top of the body. And these particular screws have just a little spot of blue Loctite on them. Now, I highly suggest you get a service manual. If you're on the Facebook page for SX Vipers and SRXs, you're going to find there's a service manual available. If you guys contact me through YouTube and you need a copy of it, let me know, and perhaps I can get a link for you or somewhere where you can download it. But if you're thrifty on the internet, just search the manual, owner's manual. When you get into the supplement for 02 to 06 Viper, you can go into section 7, which is complete carb glossary, all blown up views of everything, and it shows and talks about this. And it's got 2 pages on the setting of this particular TPS switch and measuring these little posts, powering them up and measuring them with an ohms meter so that you get the correct positioning of it. So you can see there was some blue Loctite in here. I'm going to wipe that off right now, just to make sure we're good and clean. Now, there's a little O-ring right here, and then there's little needle bearings in here on this side of the shaft, or this side of the carburetor body. And I've gone in with a little brush like this, and I've put in some white lithium grease in there. Yamaha specs a particular 2 choices of grease. I use white lithium in there, and I'm lubricating that needle bearing in there all around it, so when I put the shaft through there, it's all good and greased. You can see I've got lots of white lithium grease on this shaft as well, so when I reinsert that back in there, everything's all lubricated. The other thing you're going to be lubing when you put it back together is this little plunger here for the choke assembly. That's going to get greased. That's going to get greased. Other than that, there's no other grease that goes on it. One other mention, I did not pull these 4 screws out with this surface gasket. This is on the, what is that, intake side of the carb? Yeah, so on the intake side, you'll see these 4 screws, and you'll see this little diaphragm where the coolant lines run through the carburetor, and that's to help heat the carb so it doesn't ice up. I didn't pull that apart. I didn't have the gasket to replace it, and I didn't want to pull it and put it back together with the same gasket. I figured all that ran through that channel was the coolant, and when I immerse this in an ultrasonic carb cleaner, it's going to clean that channel out anyway, and the particular cleaner that I'm using is not really harmful to gasket material, so it should be fine with that. So I've immersed this body into a carb cleaning solution right up into here, and I've not cleaned the bearings up on the top, so that way I did not contaminate that or suck any of the grease out. I wanted to leave those lubed, so I cleaned from here down in the body, and that got into all of the orifices and cleaned everything out with the ultrasonic. And then of course I spray cleaned the whole top section and re-lubed everything on the bushings and the bearings and the seals and whatnot up on the top. Cleaned out all the channels and the cavities. And that's really the carb body ready to immerse or clean or spray or whatever else, and then blow it completely out. Then reinstall the mixture screw. If you have taken out your air bleed screw, install that back in the left channel there. Blow through every one of these orifices And with all of this removed, including removing the main nozzle, you can blow everything out in all the upper and lower channels and won't harm anything within the carburetor. So that's good to go. It goes back together in the reverse order. What I want to talk to you a little bit about here is how this functions. Now, some of you guys, it might be the first time you've ever delved into a carburetor. First thing you're going to see is that this particular slide mechanism, it's gated on one side with this little notch removed, and then it's wider on the other side. So it can go only in one way. So when you go to put it back together later, don't be intimidated, because once you have this carrier and everything attached and you've got the needle valve in there, all you can do is drop it in one way. If you try to put it in the other way, it won't fit. So it goes in this way, and then that carrier sits over here, and then that shaft goes up through it, and your screw goes in to secure it, and everything's there and done. Talking about the gate valve in it, when you pull the throttle assembly, what you're doing is you're lifting up these gates, and you're lifting up that center needle. So you can see it gets to a very fine point there. Well, I'm going to remove it for a sec. Let's talk about the functionality of this. On the very top of this main nozzle, you're going to see it's got an orifice in it. I'm not exactly sure right now what the particular dimension of that orifice should be. These are all sized accordingly. But that needle goes down inside of that, and it comes almost to a full stop. And when you look at the bottom, you'll see the needles coming through there, right on the very bottom. Well, of course, when you put the rest of these parts together, that little sleeve that fits on there and that little plastic diffuser or washer, and your main jet, what you're doing with your main jet is you're determining what the size of the opening is at the bottom of that main nozzle. This particular piece channels that fuel and sizes it up or down to allow the fuel to flow up through the main jet, up through the nozzle. And as that needle is lifted up on the slide gate, as it comes out, of course, that opening in that orifice is exposed, and that's what allows the fuel to come up. So the fuel comes up through here, mixes into this venturi here, and the air hits it as it's rushing in, atomizes all the fuel, and sucks it into the motor. So this is an important piece of the apparatus, and it's important to check this for wear. If you have a sled that doesn't run right, gets really, really bad fuel mileage, but yet it starts good and everything else, one of the things to check is this particular opening to see if it's still matched to this or if it's grossly worn. And that can happen, as I've learned from some of the guys on Totally Yamaha. So in a nutshell, that's that. In the rest of it, you need to understand the functionality of the pilot jet. So this little pilot jet, as small as it is what runs the sled from a start up until idle speed of 15 to 1800 RPM. So the fuel comes in through that inlet on the bottom, which is 45 for the size, and it comes out of all these little outlets right here. And the same thing, it mixes with the air bleed screw, controls the fuel, comes into that venturi, and I should further explain, when this is closed, the slide gate, I'll bring it back in here. When this is closed on the very bottom, you're going to see that that gate's got that little opening that we talked about earlier. That allows air to pass through there. So when you go to pull a sled over and it creates vacuum within the motor to pull air and fuel through, it's pulling the air through the bottom of that slide when it's closed. It's also pulling fuel up through that pilot jet, just enough for it to start and enough for it to run. Once it's running and idling, everything's running off this primary circuit. And nothing else happens until you hit that throttle. And that is when this opens up, exposes the rod, pulls it up out of the main nozzle here, and allows fuel to pass up through the main jet, the main nozzle, and into the venturi. So think of these two things together in unison. This little guy on the right is what runs all your 0 RPM start right up to 1500, and then your main one right here takes over as soon as you open up your throttle blades. Now fuel is passing through both of them, mainly through the center one, which is your main nozzle. So that's what brings all your fuel up into this body. when you lift up that slide mechanism. Your air bleed helps determine how much air is mixing in through it, and your fuel mixture screw here also helps adjust the air sensitivity so that you're getting the right blend of air and fuel through. Everything atomizes and everything ends up into the motor, which of course completes the combustion cycle. So hopefully that teaches you a little bit. We'll cut away to another video here on the reassembly once everything's cleaned and show you how everything goes back together. All right, I'm back at it here. So all of our small parts now have been cleaned properly with carb cleaner and or bathed in the ultrasonic bath and reassembled, lubricated, all set up, and they're all ready to go back in now. So what we're looking at here on the far left here, we've got our TPS sensor, which is external to be mounted on the side of the carburetor. For the top section, we have the gate mechanism or slide mechanism complete with the needle valve and the carrier for the top, which includes the cam and that little steel carrier that's wrapped around it. Next over here, you're going to see the float bowl, which has been completely cleaned. That was immersed in the ultrasonic cleaner. We've installed a new gasket. It's ready to go. There's our float assembly here, together with our needle and seat, which is internal right there. You can see that little silver needle that slides in and out, and our seat being the float valve assembly with a rubber O-ring, and that's a brand new O-ring. We've got our pin, which slides through this particular carrier to mount the float assembly. Next to that, we've got our pilot jet, which is positioned back in through this tube. We've got our main nozzle here, which has been cleaned and blown out. We've got the little valve and washer that goes on to the bottom of that particular section when it's back in through the body, which we'll show you here in a minute. We have our main jet. This particular one is a 153.8. That's for my elevation. I'm sitting at about 2,200 feet above sea level, and I ride on days that are minus 18 or better for Celsius. I don't like to ride when it's colder than that. If it was colder than that, then obviously I want to change that jetting size. And the same thing with altitude, depending if you're going up or down. Yamaha's got a complete chart for that. If you need that, there's reference to that on the Team Yamaha thread where I've posted a lot of this information. So next, we're going to get at this and put it all back together. We're going to start by assembling the bottom of the carburetor. We're going to start with the main nozzle. Then we're going to install this washer assembly here, the main jet, the pilot jet, the float valve, the float. And from there, we'll get into the top of the body. We'll install the gate mechanism, show you how all that kind of goes back together, assemble the body and the carb, put the float bowl back onto the bottom, and we'll get ready to put that right back into that carb rack, which is pretty straightforward. So, all right, so we're going to get started with the reassembly. I'll try to keep everything down low where you can see it with this camera. I apologize as I don't have my cameraman here today, so I'm trying to do this as a one-handed operation. And even though I got a couple small repairs, I got some cuts and stuff in here on my knuckle that sting, and this just keeps the dirt out of it. Okay, so a couple of things. Let's get started with the bottom of the carburetor. Once the body has all been cleaned and you've wiped everything out with a dry, lint-free cloth and towel, you've blown everything out with an air compressor and everything's clean and dry, no contaminants, and all your parts are clean, you can start doing the reassembly. First things first, I'm going to install the needle and seat for the float valve. That just drops in there like that, presses in. I've lubricated, put a brand new O-ring on it, and lubricated that just with a little touch of white lithium grease, just so that the O-ring goes in without damaging it if you put it into a dry bodied surface like that. Once that's in, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install a little screw in here with the captive head on it, and that's what holds, that's what holds that brass valve into the carb body. So I'll get that started here. Trusting you guys can see that. Tighten that down, and once it gets snugged up at the bottom, you're just going to give it a little pinch. Do not overpower this. Do not use power tools. Just snug it up. A little pinch at the end, and that holds that edge of that barrel down there. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to insert The needle, as you can see, it's got that little wire gate, and you'll see this little tab that's on the bottom of the float. That tab needs to be bent down just ever so slightly, where there's just enough room there, hopefully you can see that, for like a screwdriver blade to go through there, so that it's just down below the main parallel of that. The reason for that is it's going to connect to this little gate. It's going to slide up over top of that. Then once we have that in position there, you can see the two little wires on the top. We're going to pinch that with our hands so that we don't drop it. And now we've got that needle just dangling there. We're going to take the carb body. We're going to keep all that together. We're going to bring that over, and we're going to gently drop that needle down into there, verifying that we've got the little gates up above that tab, so that when the float goes up and down, it picks up the needle and moves it off the seat. Pretty straightforward stuff. We're going to come over and take this pin. We're going to install the pin in through the carrier, get it lined up to the other side. So it's starting to seat. You can see it's just raised out a little bit here. I'm going to bring my tool over, which is a automatic center punch. Going to give that a couple of taps in the center of the head. You don't want to overpower this, and you don't want to break this casting, so be very gentle. Once that's fully seated like it is there, and the pin's in through the other side, again, verify that you've got your little tabs. Now, turn this around so you can see it. Now when I lift up the float, or drop the float, you can see that the needle, little silver needle, is coming out of that brass valve. And when it comes to level, you can see that the seat is closed. So we know that when it fills up with fuel and that float rises to the top, it's going to shut that valve off and stop the fuel from flowing in. So that's done. Next thing we want to do now is install the main nozzle. So this is the top section that comes into the carb body. This is the lower section that's keyed. And this lower section, there is a little pin. Spin the carb around. Right here where my finger is, you'll see that little brass pin. You can see the pin inside of there. That's where this gate runs, so it's keyed. That when that comes back in, it sits in one position and one position only. So I'm going to drop that in there. Look at that. Just like that. I'm going to turn it. Rotate that just so I have that stuff when it's dry. Got that shaft in there, and then I push it down, and I want to bring it down until that's flush with the floor of the throttle body. Once that's all the way down, that'll be through there. Of course, that key will align with that pin. Next thing I can do is take this bushing, which slides up over top of that. You're able to see the threads inside of there then, and that's where your main jet goes in. So get your corresponding size for your particular riding temperature and elevation. Install that. And once you've got that threaded in there, do not overpower this. Make sure you use a proper width of blade on the screwdriver so you don't mangle that. Give it a little 1/8 or 1/16 of a turn when it snugs up. And that's all you need to do to that. Do not overpower it. That's done. The last thing we're going to put in is our pilot jet. So we've blown all that out and verified that's nice and clean. The orifices are good. I'm going to install that into this other hole in front of there. Get a corresponding screwdriver to fit in there. Make sure that we're not throwing any contaminants in there. So that goes right down in that little tube. And we're just going to snug that up until it makes contact with the seat. And much like the main jet, once it's tight, just a little 1/16 of a turn to make sure that it's secured. So now we've got our mixture screw bottomed out and then backed out, reversed, 1.78 turns. We have our pilot jet installed. It's been cleaned, blown out, and installed. Same with the carb body and everything else. We've installed our main nozzle and then our washer assembly onto it. with the diffuser, and we've set our pilot jet in and tightened it down. We've installed our new seal, O-ring seal, on the needle valve and float. We've got the float and everything in there, tested and adjusted. So everything in the bottom of the bowl now is done. The only thing we have left to do now is to put on the bowl. So the bowl's all been cleaned, it's spotless. Got a brand new gasket in there. We're going to set that in place. Everything's been cleaned and dried and wiped off. And we're going to wipe that off just around the surface one more time, just to ensure we have no contaminants. And we'll set that gasket in place, and we'll install the 4 screws on the bottom. And that's all there is to the reassembly of the carb. Now that makes it look easy. We did it pretty quick. You can back this video up, study this until you're comfortable. Take lots of pictures when you do this. You can always use the pictures as a reference. And get yourself a service manual. Get into the carb section or go on to Babbitt's Online. Babbitt's Online has all kinds of exploded views on all the parts, carburetors, every part in your snowmobile. You can get an exploded view. That'll help you put something back. If you drop a part or you find something laying on your bench that's foreign and you know it should be installed, you can go back in, figure out where it's supposed to go, and install it. And the biggest thing is have fun. I mean, I'm no sled mechanic. I'm not a licensed mechanic. I'm not a Yamaha guy. I'm not certified in any way, shape, or form. I do this because I enjoy it, not because I'm cheap. I don't mind spending money and having this stuff serviced, but there's a lot more enjoyment in doing it yourself. There's a keen sense of satisfaction you get by servicing this stuff yourself. And really, that's it. When you've cleaned the body, reassembled all the float bowl and all the assembly and all the parts, this is what you've got. So now, from the floor of the carburetor down, everything is done and assembled. We've already cleaned all of the slide mechanism, the carrier. This has all been cleaned, it's all been lubricated. We've had everything out and verified the position of the needle inside of the gate, and there's a separate video we'll cut to here in a minute for that. And then we'll come back to installing this. So we've got this slide, which is in really good shape. There's just a little bit of wear on these gates, the valves, or whatever you want to call them, gate valve or slide gate. Not very much wear on the other side at all. It actually looks real good. So that's all good. There's our needle, which has all been cleaned. We've got 2 washers right here, plastic washers, little shims. And we've got our clip on the middle position. So that's going to go back in now. We'll drop that into the middle. Drop that down, so we've got that in position. It looks like a little baseball diamond. You'll see it's like home base is here, first, second, and third. So it's pretty easy the way it's keyed to fit into here. You can see that the baseball diamond shape is there as well. So this can only go in one way. And of course the 2 screws are 45 degrees to each other. So we're going to set that in there. And if I can find where I put my Allen key, it's right there. I'm going to get that screw started. These are ball milled. Allen keys. I think this one I'm working with is a T10. So that one's in, snug down. Second one's in. It's snug. I'm going to put this end of the wrench on it. Give that a little tweak. Doesn't need much, just a 16th or an 8th of a turn. So you can see those screws are in there. Here's one. There's the other side. All right, so you've seen how that's all cleaned. Now this assembly's been serviced and cleaned and inspected. It's ready to go back in. Our body is all cleaned out and wiped out. We're going to take this slide, which can only go in one way, and we're going to drop it into the top of the body with these 2 particular slide areas here and here going in, and this is going to drop right into position where that throttle shaft will go through and pick up this carrier once we put that remaining bolt back into the top of the carrier. So with that done and said, we can spin the carb around, we can lift up the gate assembly, we can see everything's working good here, and nothing's binding, nothing's sticking, everything is good in there. So we're going to put that carb body now back onto the rack. So now that we have the PTO side off and we've exploded some of that to show you guys how to service it, I want to take this back apart to show you how this spring and everything comes apart. So the spring itself, it's a little tough to see here. Get my little pointer out. There's a portion of the spring that's hooked around this little aluminum stud on the back side of this cam, and this would be on the back side of the carburetors. Sorry, the front side. There's this little spring hooked around this pin. On the back side of the carburetor, the other side of that spring comes around, it rolls up and comes over this piece right here. Now, you're not going to be able to roll that in and out after the fact, so I'm going to show you a little cheat, what I found with this. I tried to clock this whole spring assembly. I'm talking about this spring in here. That's what puts the tension on this whole clutched cam mechanism and throttle bar assembly. It puts the cancel pressure back on this so that it snaps shut, and you want that wound up. But it's difficult to do. If you try to leave those bars on there, it's pretty much impossible to do. So this is the way I found to do it. Might not be the right way, but it works for me. So, all right, first things first. You've got the first carb taken off. You're ready to clean it or service it. You want to take this carb off, and it's the middle one, and the controlling carb. Take this screw out of the center. This, again, connects your cam to that throttle shaft. Secure that screw, set it aside, and again, it's the pan head screw, whatever you call that, the recess screw. I always forget the terminology when I want it. And now there's nothing holding this carburetor onto the shaft. So I'm going to start to back it off, and you're going to see this kind of snap out of there. So I can take this spring, I'll slide it off of that little pin right there, excuse me. And now that spring's disassembled from there. The next thing we need to do is take out this Torx wire right here. And the way that that comes out is pretty slick. You think of unwinding it, it's going to undo it. Well, it doesn't. This needs to slide down out of this zinc plated gate, and that whole little wire assembly will just slide down. It's spring loaded, and it'll pop itself right out of there. So the way you do that is by going clockwise. So as you go clockwise, it's tightening, but it's also pushing down and releasing in a reverse thread that Torx switch. You're going to see it pop right out of there in a moment. Almost near the end. Is it out of there? It should be. Yep. So I'm just releasing the cam, because the cam, this little button on the cam that you're seeing, it sits on the bottom of this. And it's all kind of wedged in there. So take the cam and release it by hand, and that will allow you to take that whole little Torx switch and the spring assembly out of there. So it's pretty slick. All right, so with that being done, now we can take this whole assembly apart. So you heard the spring snap, and that whole carburetor now is going to slide right off there. But what I want you to pay attention to here, I'm just going to move some tools back onto the bench so I don't drop anything here. Right in here, you're going to see this particular cam in the center carb. It doesn't have that gold carrier or that adjustment screw in here, just the actual aluminum cam. So it's all cast aluminum, there's no steel parts, but there is a small washer in here. And it's located right in between the casting, right here on this little shoulder, and the cam itself. Right where I'm touching, there's a plastic washer, a shim. Make sure when you take this apart, I'm going to slide that shaft right out of there, that you capture that and put it back in there. So this spring assembly comes out, that little particular piece of the spring will wind out of there. I've cleaned all this in parts cleaner, just like the carb parts. Sprayed it all clean, wiped it all down, and I've re-lubricated it. And this is one of the things that needs to get greased. I've also put some white lithium grease around this particular shoulder that it sits in. And the reason for that is so that it does not wear on the aluminum body of the carburetor. So the only thing left to take apart on this one, on the top section here, you take these two screws out, and that will take this adjusting carrier. This is where your throttle cable comes in. It'll take that off to the carb body, and that leaves you with your normal carburetor. So you can dissect the choke mechanism here, the plungers, and take these apart, clean them, lubricate them with a light coating of grease, and there's a specific grease for that. I'm using white lithium, which is number 105 on lubriplates, motor assembly lube, and use it very sparingly, just enough to coat it. Again, I'm not taking anything apart on the upper part of the body. I'll take the slide mechanism out, and that's pretty straightforward. I can take that out now. So that's it out of there. And I'll set that aside. The only other parts we're going to take apart are the bottom. And we've covered all that on the other carburetors, so you're going to see all that go back together. When you put it back together and you've cleaned the body or sprayed it or cleaned it and taken all the float assemblies and everything apart on the bottom bowl, and you're satisfied everything's clean, you're ready to assemble it, clean the body, wipe it all down, spray the outside, spray the inside, blow it all out with a lot of compressed air, make sure it's squeaky clean, and start the reassembly process just as you see it on the other ones. So now I will drop this gate mechanism back in here, and we will button this one back up, put it back onto the carb slide. There's that one little nylon bushing. That's going to go right in here. And we're ready to put that spring assembly back in, and I wanted to show you this. So sorry if I pulled any of this out of the camera's view here. It's a bad habit of lifting things up. So I'm going to take that one hook, put it in behind there like such. You'll see it goes around that back leg. I'm going to pop this over with that nylon bushing. And now we're ready to clock this back onto this cam. So the other thing I did is after I've cleaned up all the carbs and restarted the assembly process, you're going to see over here, I've got a pretty good liberal coating of grease. So I cleaned this entire shaft, cleaned all this area in here, and re-greased all that. And that's all as per the factory spec and the chassis spec. So make sure you do all of that. Right now I'm going to put a little bit of grease. Just put a little bit on my finger and put a little bit back onto the shaft before I reassemble it, just so that I don't drag any grease through with me from other areas that I need it to stay on. So there we go, nice little coating on it, nothing too much. Now I'm ready to put that carb back in here and show you how to clock it. So we've got our little nylon washer in there still. We're going to put this shaft in through here. We're going to verify that we got the shaft going through the center and our washer is locked in place. Success. Now you see right here, I'm going to bring it close. So there's the hook on that spring right here in the center of the screen. And there's the little pin that it needs to go onto. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring it in. Now we're going to wind the carburetor up. So we'll bring it around a full turn, and then we'll seat it into place. So now we've pushed it in that way. And the way you know that you've got it in the right position, you're compressing everything and clamping it together. And then you want to go in here. And now what I can do is I can look inside of this hole. I don't know if you guys can see that, but in here, there's the hole in the black bar. Remember I said it's keyed and it's threaded? Well, that's where that screw goes. So now that I'm holding all the spring assembly and everything together, I've got it all wound up with some tension on it. I'm going to take that screw, and I'm going to thread it back into the hole. And once I get that started, and that pan head just kind of sits in there the way it's supposed to, it's going to key itself, which it's done. So now that's in position. That can't come apart now. Now I can start putting the slide rails in on the front and the back, and this is all in the correct corresponding position. See, so we've got those two cured. That's connected, that's connected. We've lubricated that shaft. We're kind of golden. So we're gonna go ahead and put these two bars back together. These only went one way. There's a top and a bottom. The spacing's different on the top and the bottom. You bring the bottom one in here and you're gonna have this channel that fits around this particular casting leg right here where your adjustment and your fuel enrichment screw is. So I'm gonna start the first screw on there and just snug it down to hold that bar in place. Take a second screw while it's still kind of loose and it's movable. I'll start that second one. Same thing with the other carburetor. Way over on this side, we'll get this one done. Just get that screw started. Get the last one in position. And we don't want to tighten these down until we've got pretty much everything in place. So just gently snug it up. So there's two of them installed. That shows you how to key that spring without having to fight with it. You don't need any special pullers or tools. And when you're all done with that, that action works great. Right now what we're going to do is put that Torx switch back in there. Let me find out where I put it. So this particular switch is going to sit up inside this zinc plated carrier. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the cam out of the way and open that up. And we're going to set that spring up inside of there. And then we're going to bring this up and close that cam, which is going to kind of hold that into position. And then we're going to tighten up this screw, which is going to be reverse. It's counter threaded, right? Reverse threaded. So we're going to unwind it, and that's going to start to thread into that plastic sleeve. That's going to allow this to rise up inside of this gate. Kind of sounds wonky, doesn't it? So reverse, and there it is already. It's threading into there. It's bringing it up. Now, I didn't really measure where it was, but it was about 5 to 6 turns from when it was all the way out, because I went the wrong way first, which is right there. So it's kind of bottomed out. So 1, 4, 5, 6 half turns. That's kind of roughly where it was. I will check that later, because this is your Torx setting here. You see when I open up the cam, that little button right there. Use this as a pointer. So in this switch, the Torx switch, the cam and that little button on the bottom of this cam closes up and closes that switch. And I'm hoping you can see that action there. If I need to adjust that later, I can adjust that. And that's about it. So those two carbs are done. Dropped one of my cloths here that I was using to keep stuff protected on the bench. I am going to now tighten these down, just make sure they're locked. Same thing with this one. That's good. So I'm going to put the gaskets back on there. Give that just a little wipe to make sure there's no contaminants on it. And now that those are both on there, I can go ahead and reintroduce those two gaskets. Put the top cap on it. Hopefully that's not out of the camera's view. That's that one started. Same thing on this side. We put new gaskets in there. And those are part number 89A14198-00. And they come in a 3-pack of gaskets for that top cap. Snug those up. All right, we got one more to put on over here. Hopefully I'm not boring you guys with this. Should get this wrapped up pretty quick. Get that last carburetor on there, and then we can start reassembling the choke assembly. You know, the one thing I was intimidated by was the timing of that whole cam and spring assembly. And when I really figured it out, it was so easy to do. So there's both of those buttoned back up. Of course, we got that throttle cam and everything all good. Then we can lift it up. We got positive action on the cam to stop the gates. Got good adjustment on all the airflow gates in there. So we'll get that last carb body on here and we'll get to the next section. All right, so we've got the last carb body slid onto the rail. Just putting in the 2 bottom screws. And that ties the carrier bar together for all 3 carbs now on the bottom. We'll install that top one here in a moment. Take off a little excess grease from that throttle shaft. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install that last screw up into the top. So we're good to go with that one. Make sure we've got that totally aligned in here. Set that screw in. And we get that one started. Sounds like my cameraman's back home now. Maybe I'll have a helper to hold the camera. All right, so I'm going to thread that cam back down onto that throttle shaft. That's what, again, creates all the timing. Tighten that one down. Everything else in here is good. We've cleaned, verified everything, so now we can put that last gasket and top cap back into place. All right, so 3rd carb's back into position now. Now we're going to put this last bar together on here. Need to gather up and find all the screws. I kind of got them laying all over the place here. So we're going to get all those started. 2 screws into each carb body at the top and the bottom. And that is the 3 carburetors assembled onto the throttle slide, that shaft. They're all tightened down to the tops of the bodies with the caps staked back on. New gaskets. And we've put now both carrier bars back on. Tighten them down. So, carbs are all buttoned up. They're all cleaned. They're all serviced. Top, bottom, bodies, everything. This is awesome. This is the way I like to clean things and make sure it's thorough. So now I can take that cam mechanism and open it up. And I'm checking the timing on the middle one. As soon as I see that carb get to the top, my other one's keyed exactly the same, and they are. So everything there is perfectly timed. I got great cancellation of that. Everything's all cleaned and serviced and verified and torqued and tightened down on the bottom of the body. I got the torus position wire back in here. So now, on this side of the carburetor, when the switch goes in, it's got a timing spot in there, a cam slot in there. We're going to put that on in the appropriate position, just like that. And you can see that it's spring-loaded. As I grab one figure here and I let go of it, it snaps back. So this particular, put that cam right in there properly. And then we're going to put the last 2 screws back in here, which are these specialty screws. They're T25s, and they've got that little pin in the middle. So it's like a safety piece, that a security screw, if that's what you want to call it. So we're going to put our tool back in there. Now these call for blue Loctite, but before I go and tighten them down, I am going to test all this out first. I'm going to lock them into position, and once I've tested everything and I know it's all good, I don't need to move this switch, and I'll tighten them down. I'll take them back out and just put a spot of blue Loctite on each one. And I remember now from when I took this apart, it was very much in a full counterclockwise position. So I'm putting it right back, and I have pictures of that. Putting it right back in the same position where I had the bulk of this hollow area showing above the screw, and on the left side I had the screwdriver tip fitting in there. And yeah, it's not a perfect science, but that's what we're going to try today. And I'll put this back together. We'll get all this running, plug all this in, start it up, get it primed and get it running, and see if we have any TPS issues with the throttle position switch or the torque settings. Once you go back into a carburetor this far to clean everything and take it all apart, you want to put it back together and be taking notes on all that to make sure you don't have any issues. I think we'll be in good shape. So that's kind of it. We're going to get into the next step, which is going to be putting together all the antifreeze coolant lines in between here, putting all the bleed lines back on for the air bleeds. And then we're going to assemble the choke assembly onto this side. So we'll go through and put that assembly back in there, and that'll happen next. All right. So one thing I didn't mention and I wanted to show you guys, this is the choke assembly. So these are on the side of the exterior of the body here, and you usually see these little cams sticking through there like such. These need to be lubricated with grease, and when I cleaned these out, I did not do that, so I'm just taking these apart right now and I am lubricating these. So just a light paste. I'm using, again, white lithium grease. Yamaha's got their own spec for this. I'm going to put a little on there. I'm going to depress this. I'm going to put a little bit on there so that nothing is sticking. And that will go back into that body, which has been cleaned out and blown out. And those will go back in there now, and I'll thread that back in there, that cam. And once that's snugged down in there, that's all been lubricated. We're ready to put those choke slides back together again. Getting back to the carbs here, we have now pulled apart all the choke plungers and lubricated all of those. Those all work great. Everything's all cleaned out inside those chambers. So we're ready to install the slide mechanism. And it goes right up through the carb body here, just above the venturis. There's a little orifice there right outside of the choke plunger. And this rod that I'm holding in my hand here, I have taken the responsibility to lubricate it with a little bit of white lithium grease. I'm going to insert that into that orifice. I am then going to install the other cams. So I think I've got it right. These get keyed like this, and these cams go onto these little mechanisms before you thread the rod through it. So I'm going to set those, each of those, into their respective positions. And then I'm going to put the rod through it and into there. It looks good so far. The only one I haven't done here is the end. I'll do that one last. On this far end, Once we've come through, we're going to put this spring on. And then we're going to put this nylon piece in there. Here it is. So this is keyed in such a way that this hole fits over this pin and the second one lines with the screw. And that will align with that little plastic cam. Just like that. Nothing to it. Piece of cake. Okay, that should work fine. Tighten that up. Okay, so I got a little timing left to do here. I've got this cam situated over the plunger. I've got this cam situated over the plunger. What I need to do now is take the one off on the back, which I've already kind of set just so it would stay there. You need to take that one out. It's going to be tricky. I'm going to get that adjusted like that before. There, it's on there. It was a little tricky just to get that on there and keyed and get it secured properly. I'm going to try to get these all set up where they are originally set. I can see the little dimples in the rods where the set screws go in. So I'm going to try to key these all properly. Put all these set screws back in exactly where the rods are dimpled so that I have them in the correct corresponding positions that they were in before. The details, right? The devil is in the details. One last set screw to put in on this far side. Okay, those are all locked in. So, there we go. I'm operating the slide on the far side. So, when I put the choke cable down through here and lock the cam in, I'll be lifting up on this, which pulls out all of those slide mechanisms. So they've all been lubricated. They've all got white lithium grease on them. Same thing inside the shaft. I'm going to wipe off any excess. That's on the shaft outside of the area that it travels, so we don't attract any dirt that we don't need. Okay, I think we're good. That works better than it ever did. So what's left? Little bleeder lines that we got to put on there, which will just take a moment. Got a wiring sensor to put in on the TPS end of things. So let's get busy with that. All of these little air bleeds are going to pop right on without any issue. So I'm putting on the far right. Get the middle one on. And PTO side. Okay. All the air bleeds are in place. I need to get all these coolant lines back installed. I'm going to start with this side. That was easy. And that one, they said, that was easy. Staples. That was easy. Okay, coolant lines are in there. I need to get these clamps all back on there. And put the wiring sensor in there. That side like such. That wire comes through there like that. And then put a couple tie wraps on there and tie those up. And that carb setup is 100% done. So just going to get these clamps back into position and then we're good. So now we're looking at a fully restored, cleaned and serviced set of Mikuni TM33 flat side carburetors for an SX Viper 700 triple. We have serviced everything in this rack, completely disassembled the rack, took apart each individual carburetor fully completely, took apart the float bowls on all three carbs, serviced the main jet, the pilot jet, float mechanisms including the needle valve and seat. We also check out the mixture screws and the air bleeds, checked out everything, checked out the main nozzles, made sure there was a good interference fit and no significant wear between the nozzle and the needle. And we took apart all the tops of the carb bodies, all the main slides and everything in them were all removed, cleaned and serviced. So we've been in the top to bottom, we've verified the choke assembly is all serviced. All of those choke horns are all lubed up. The shaft is all lubed up. On the other side of the body, we'll take a look at this and we'll inspect the throttle slides. Everything is smooth and functional. Needles, seats, everything good. Entire bodies have been cleaned. We've redone all the air bleeds, tie wrapped everything tidy and neat. And all the bodies are completely cleaned and serviced. So this is one spanky looking rack of carbs. So it's ready to go back into service. We did get an inch of snow last night. Woohoo! So excited. First inch in the last 60 days, which is absolutely pathetic if you're into snowmobiling, but what else are we gonna do? So that's my first time doing a full rack of carbs. I thoroughly enjoyed working on this. The only thing I'm not too sure about yet is the positioning of that TPS switch. Now I've set it exactly where it was before I took it apart, and I did clock that and measure it. So I shouldn't have any issues with that. Once I connect this into the harness, go ahead and prime this, change all the fluids in the tank, and put some high test fuel in there. We should be able to fire this right up. Should start and run like a clock. Hopefully there's no issues. If there is, then I'll have to take this TPS sensor apart and measure the ohm settings on it and adjust it as needed. And aside from that, this carb rack is ready to go. So I'm quite proud of this one. I'm happy to have completed it myself and not had to take it into a shop to pay somebody else to do it. And to be honest with you, I know from the level of detail that I went into with this, I don't think there's many shops that would do that type of service unless they were charging you a pretty penny. And I'm not talking about $300 or $400. We're talking several hundred, $800, $900, $1,000 or more to do the type of service that was just done on this. So fully involved, everything done, nothing overlooked, and these carbs are like brand new. So it's awesome. They should be good for years to come. And hopefully in the next few years, all I have to do is take apart the lower float bowls, clean out the pilot jets, and make sure that everything's good to go every season. So another one notched up. Next up, we're going to be working on some clutches and changing some fluids in the chain case.